It's the disease that's hiding in plain sight. It can be in your neighborhood, in your car, or even in your bed. That's right. It's called toxic masculinity, and over 40% of men are affected every day. Worst of all, toxic masculinity is contagious. So if you're infected, you need to know right away so you can avoid spreading it to your friends and your family. Are you or a loved one suffering from toxic masculinity? Look out for these warning signs. Even the faintest whisper of facial hair. If you have a mustache, schedule a checkup. If you find a goatee on your face, consider going to the emergency room. If you have a full beard, well, it's probably too late for you. Mowing the lawn instead of letting your wife do it for the sake of equality. Oof, not good. Let your wife break the lawn mowing glass ceiling today. Eating meat on occasion. A disease like toxic masculinity can quickly change your diet. If you find yourself leaving your vegan avocado quinoa toast smoothies untouched in favor of wolfing down some bacon-wrapped bacon, you might have toxic masculinity. Throwing a professional wrestler off a steel cage right through the announcer's table. Men who suddenly look around and find that they're tossing a professional wrestler off a steel cage to plummet right through the announcer's table are at high risk of developing toxic masculinity. If a man in your life is suffering from this symptom, encourage him to stop wrestling in the WWE immediately. Holding the door open for a woman once in a while. Wow. This one is really bad. You need to do better if you're gonna beat this thing. One way to fight this symptom is to slam the door right in a woman's face and scream, "Equality!" through the glass. When she glares at you, try it today. Yelling stuff about freedom and charging into battle wearing blue face paint. If you find yourself charging into battle against the English wearing blue face paint of the 14th century, you might be beyond medical help. Do all of society a favor and get yourself drawn and quartered so no one else catches this contagious illness. Thinking about the Roman Empire. Even once. Even thinking about the Roman Empire one time can be a deadly omen. Further stages of this disease can cause men to think about worse things, like the Galactic Empire, the Kingdom of Gondor, or the Imperium of Man. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only toxic masculinity. And finally, being a man who does not hate himself. This is the most telling sign. If you're a biological male and you don't hate yourself, toxic masculinity is already coursing through your veins. If there's going to be any hope of recovery, you need to begin hating yourself today. If you or your man are showing one or more of these symptoms, contact your medical professional today. Get help before it's too late. If you think of any other symptoms of toxic masculinity, leave them in the comments down below.
Morning, guys. Good to see you here this morning. Good to meet some new guys, and good to see some old guys that I haven't seen in a while. Good to have you here. And as Nathan said, we are in our current series, What is a Man? We've been doing that for about 8 months now. I think this is 7 months. This is our 7th talk. And the subtitle of this series is The Most Important Question that you and I as men must answer. Now the question is, why is that the most important question that you and I as men need to answer in the course of our life? Well, the reason it is because God made the world to need men. God made the world to need you, not as a person, but as a man. He made the world to need me also, not just as a person, but as a man. He made the world to need not just any kind of man, though, but men of moral character, men of moral clarity, men with moral courage, and men with moral conviction. He made the world to need men who will live out their masculine design by moving forward into the chaos in order to bring order and beauty and life to our world. That's why the world needs men. The problem today is that those kind of men are largely missing in our world. And as a result, what do we see happening? Our world is falling apart. Chaos is expanding. And order and beauty are disappearing. Which means then that if our world is going to have any hope to restore order, to diminish chaos, then men, not just in this little group here, but men across the world are going to need to return to the place of living out the design that God has given to them from the very beginning. We need to return to living out our masculine design. Thus, we're asking the question, what is a man? Now, to answer that question, what we've been doing over the last 7 months is we've been looking into the Bible as our source to answer that question. The reason we're looking there is because we believe that the Bible is the revealed Word of God. It's where God is revealed to us, to mankind, who He is, who we are, what the world is about, and what He has created us as human beings to be and to live and how to function in this world. Specifically, how He has created us as men to be in this world. So we've looked there and we focused on 3 things. First, a command, a New Testament command. We looked at that. We then looked at a Bible study rule, a rule of Bible study, and then a key question to consider. Now, if you've been here, you know that the New Testament command that we've been looking at is from 1 Corinthians 16:13, where Paul says to us, act like men. And in the original Greek, it's not just a statement of, it would be nice, it's a command. God is commanding us to act like men, or it can also be translated, be manly. Be manly. Now, being manly or acting like a man presupposes something, doesn't it? It presupposes there is a standard, a way to be a man, and there's a way not to be a man. So we then said, what does that look like? And that brought us to our second focus, a Bible study rule. And the rule we looked at was this. While the Bible was written for us today, it was not written to us. God gave it to us so that we can learn about Him, about ourselves, about everything He wants us to know. But when it was written, it was not written exactly to us. It was written to who? To people 2,000 years ago. And so what we said then, if that's the case, if the Bible was written for us, but it wasn't written to us, it was written to an original audience that would have heard this act like men very different than we hear it today, then the question we need to ask is, how did first century men understand this command? How we understand what it means to act like a man up, however you want to put it, would be very different than how they would have understood it. And if we're going to understand what God is saying to us, then we have to go back to the first century and find out, how did these men understand acting like men, what that looked like. And so we did, and we went back to the first century and we looked at that and we said, okay, men in the first century would have gone naturally back to the Genesis creation story, Genesis 1 and 2, where God speaks into the world, into the chaos. He brings order, beauty, and life to the world, and then He creates man and woman, and He says specifically to the man, go into the world, protect, provide, use your strength and power to do what I've done. And what we saw then is that men are embodied male image bearers, as we look back in Genesis 1 and 2, designed to reflect God's life-giving power, the same power that God moved into the chaos to create order, beauty, and life. God calls us and designed us as men to reflect, with bold masculine movement, to do what? To bring order and beauty and life to the world. Thus, based on the creation story, we said what it means then to act like a man simply means something like this. Acting like the God of Genesis 1. We look and see this is who the God who has made us, Genesis 1. Genesis 2, in essence, says, now act like the God as a man who made you. And when you do that, what we see is that we act like the God of Genesis 1, we act like men by moving forward. Masculinity is always about movement. It's about forward movement. What men hate most is to feel stuck, is to feel paralyzed. They don't know what to do. Men want to know what to do. They want to know how to do it. Why? Because men were made to move. And when you don't know what to do or how to do it, what do? You get anxious. Because men hate being stuck. They're made to move. And so we act like God by moving forward, Where? Into the chaotic places of our worlds. Wherever the chaos of your world is, that's where God has made you as a man to move into. How? We saw this with the courage of a warrior. It doesn't mean you're not afraid to move. It means that you move in spite of the fear. You're moving into that place. And the imagination of a poet. That the idea is there is you see beyond. You see what is, but you see what could be. And that's where we trust God that He is going to work in us and through us as we reflect His power. Now, why do we do that? In order to create good spaces, good environments, good places characterized by order, beauty, and life. Now, question. Why do those places, those environments, those spaces need to be characterized by order, beauty, and life? What happens in a space like that? What happens in an environment like that? Why did God create a world at the beginning of order, beauty, and life and place Adam and Eve in it? And then He said what? Flourish. Guys, we create spaces of order, beauty, and life. What for? So that people can thrive. So that relationships can flourish. Your marriage, your family, your community. And so that God's larger purposes for the world can be advanced. That's what our movement is for. Put another way, and this has been our definition that we've given to the question, what is a man? Here's our answer. A man is an adult human male image bearer, created and designed by God. You cannot understand who we are as a man apart from the fact that there is a God who has created us with a specific design, a male image bearer. And as a male image bearer created and designed by God, we are to create environments of order, beauty, and life where people can thrive and relationships can flourish. By how? By faithfully reflecting God's creative power that boldly speaks and moves into the chaos to tame and to subdue it. Put it another way, that's our identity. A man is an adult, human male image bearer created and designed by God. That's who we are, guys. That's our purpose. What's our purpose? What are we for? To create environments of order, beauty, and life where people can thrive and relationships can flourish. And how do we do that? What's our function? By faithfully reflecting God's creative power. Not just by reflecting power in any way, but by faithfully reflecting it in a way that God reflects His power. That boldly speaks and moves into the chaos to tame and subdue it. That's who we are as men. Now, last time, if you were here, you know that we focused on this question. If God designed men to reflect His creative, life-giving power through bold forward movement, and He has, that's what we're for, that's what we're about, that's who we are, then why is it that we struggle so much to be the men that God not only designed us to be, but calls us to be, but also commands us to be, act like men? Why is that such a struggle for us? Another way we asked it was this: why is it that men fail to launch into manhood? That's a real problem for us as men. We fail to launch into manhood. And what we suggested is that men fail to launch basically due to one primary thing, and that is the legacy of Adam. Now, what's the legacy of Adam? Well, if you were here, you know that we looked at Genesis 3, and we saw that Adam was created, and he was created to be a man, and he was placed in the garden to dispel and protect the world from chaos, to reflect God's power in that way. But when the chaos shows up in the garden, what does Adam do? Adam fails to act like a man. He fails to live out his design. There is no masculine movement. Notice, he is silent in the face of the temptation. He is passive. He doesn't say anything. He doesn't do anything. He forgets. And what does he forget? Who he is as a man and what he was made for, what God designed him and calls him to be. He forgets that. And he listens. He listens not to God's word, but to who? Well, God tells us in Genesis 3, because you listen to the voice of your wife. Not that we shouldn't listen to our wives, guys, but the idea here is that you listen to her invitation to go against me instead of my word that told you how to deal with this. And as a result of Adam's failure, he leaves for you and me a legacy into which not just we are born, but to men all through human history have been born. And that legacy consists of several things. First, it consists of a broken and adversarial world. The world is now a broken and adversarial place. It used to work with us, it used to work for us, but now it works against us. And as a result, masculine movement that was once exhilarating and joyful has now become difficult and exhausting. You shall toil and sweat, God says, as you move into the world. And all of this, the broken world and the difficult movement, now creates a terrifying question in the soul of every man. You know what that question is, guys? That every man asks? Am I enough? Do I have what it takes to be a man in this world? Do I have what it takes to tame the chaos and to subdue the darkness? Do I have what it takes? And when a man begins to ask that question, it generates in his heart and in his soul fear. Do I have what it takes? Shame. I don't have what it takes. And anger. I don't have what it takes. And what that does then, it also generates a commitment to avoid the chaos. I'm going to avoid anything that it's going to expose my inadequacy and the misuse of power. I'm going to attack anything that might expose my inadequacy. Guys, that's the legacy of Adam that affects all of us. And we feel it every day. We get up and we go to work and we come home and we relate with our families, we relate with our workmates, we relate with our community, we engage the world. That's the legacy that we all are born into. And it's the legacy that his son Cain was born into. We see this legacy of Adam starting with Cain. Remember? If you were here last time, we saw the story of Cain, Genesis 4. And let me just run through this story real quickly. God confronts Adam's firstborn son. Remember that? Cain and Abel? And Cain, after he kills his younger brother. Now, why does he kill his younger brother? Because his sacrifice was inadequate before God and his brother's wasn't. And so his inadequacy triggers, that feeling of inadequacy triggers a misuse of power. And the misuse of power is what? He murders his brother. Second, because Cain violated the community by the misuse of power, he would be denied the blessing of community by being sentenced by God to be a wanderer in the world. Remember? You're going to wander. That's going to be your punishment. Cain, however, complains to God that living outside the blessing of community is going to be too much for him. He ain't going to be able to bear it. And he feels powerless and vulnerable, and he says, God, if I am a wanderer, then I'm going to die. People are going to kill me. And so what does God do? God hears his concern, and God mercifully promises Cain's life will be spared, but he must still be a wanderer apart from community. I'm not going to let anyone kill you, but neither am I going to take away the consequence for you killing your brother. You're still going to be a wanderer as a result of misusing your power. But what happens? Well, instead of submitting to God's way and trusting God's promise of protection, Cain, remember what it says, the last verse in chapter 4, he settles down and he builds a city to protect himself from a threatening world. And then we saw there's an interesting passage in the New Testament. It warns us as men, don't go the way of Cain. Question, what's the way of Cain? Well, Jude 1, verse 11 says this, woe to them, for they have gone the way of Cain. What's the way of Cain? Well, if you look back at the story in Genesis 4, we can summarize the way of Cain something like this. It's trusting our own way and our own wisdom and our own resources to protect those vulnerable places in our lives where we as men feel weak and inadequate, rather than risk trusting God's way and God's wisdom and God's promises for that protection. In other words, I'm afraid as a man that I'm not going to be able to make it, but instead of trusting God for that fear and that protection, I'm going to trust my own resources. That's the way of Cain. Another way of putting it, the way of Cain is the commitment to building our own cities. Building our own cities. So after looking at the way of Cain, we then ask this question. What happens when a man infected with the legacy of Adam, which we all are, goes the way of Cain? Instead of trusting God with his fear of inadequacy, he now begins to trust himself in his own ways, in his own resources. What happens when we build our own cities? And we concluded with this answer. If you're here, remember it. What it does, it creates in a man a domino effect that begins to diminish his masculinity. And I gave you kind of a 4 downward steps. The first one was self-doubt, which was, do I have what it takes? It's the legacy of Adam. That then moves me to self-trust. What am I going to trust? Well, I'm not going to trust God. I'm going to trust myself. I will make life work without God. That's the way of Cain. So the legacy of Adam, self-doubt, moves me to what am I going to trust? And I'm not going to trust God. I'm going to go the way of Cain. Self-trust, the way of Cain. And when I take those 2 steps, it then brings me to another step downward. 3 idolatrous commitments. These come out of the way of Cain and the legacy of Adam. What are they? Number 1, I must figure out what to do. I must protect something vulnerable within me. And I must find relief. And when we make those commitments, and by idolatrous commitments, I mean commitments that leave God out of the picture, I'm going to make these commitments and they have nothing to do with God in terms of trusting Him for protection. It's all about how am I going to find protection. It brings me to 2 kinds of bad movement. 2 kinds of bad movement. The dreamer and the destroyer. And we said last time that all of this, these 4 steps downward, creates a sub-masculine man. A man who is not living as God designed him to be. A man who is not acting like the man God created him to act like. And this produces then men who fail to launch. And then what I want us to see today, men who use masculinity in toxic ways. That's what we're going to see. That sub-masculine men will always manifest toxic masculinity. So today's topic, as Nathan said, as you saw with the Babylon Bee video, toxic masculinity. And I want to begin by asking 3 questions because we hear about this all the time. First question is this: what in the world is toxic masculinity? Now, I want to begin by telling you how I'm going to define it for us, okay? Here's how I'm going to define toxic masculinity, because I do believe it is a real thing. It's not just something made up. It is something real. So what is toxic masculinity? Here's my definition. It's a perversion of masculinity. It's a perversion of God's design of masculinity that harms rather than blesses, that is life-diminishing rather than life-giving. What is masculinity made to do? Men were built to bless. Men who live submasculine lives and are manifesting toxic masculinity, they're not going to bless, they're going to harm. Men who live according to how God designed them to live, to reflect His power, are going to be life-giving in how they relate. They're going to create life-giving places where people thrive, relationships flourish. Men who don't live according to that design, men who pervert that design, it isn't going to be life-giving, it's going to be life-diminishing. So that's how we're going to operate this morning out of what is toxic masculinity. It's a perversion of masculinity that harms rather than blesses, is life-diminishing rather than life-giving. And here's something I want you to see, extremely important. Usually we think of toxic masculinity as somebody who's a jerk, who misuses power to hurt and abuse and all that. And I believe that that's true. And why is that true? Because he's using his masculinity to harm, not to bless, to diminish life, not to give life. But think with me, guys, how about on the other end of the spectrum, the wimp? We would usually not think of this guy as toxic masculinity, would we? But let me ask you this. A wimp is somebody that doesn't move. He's afraid, so he hides and he avoids. Is that a perversion of masculinity? Yes, it is. Does that harm rather than bless? Yes, it does. Does that diminish life rather than give life? Yes, it does. So what I want you to see then is that when we're talking about toxic masculinity, we're not just talking about jerks. We're talking about wimps too. We're talking about any kind of man that lives his life in this world in a way that harms, that his masculinity harms and does not bless. It diminishes life rather than blesses life. And let me just tell you this. Any man that is living outside of the design that God has given is not going to be a man who blesses or gives life. He might be a nice guy and do nice things, but it isn't ultimately going to do what God has designed him to do and what God made the world to need, those kind of men. Now, how does our culture define toxic masculinity? Well, here's your typical definition. Male sexism, homophobia, dominance, aggression, and violence. And whoever you talk to, they're going to give you a different definition for what each of those little words mean there. But behind this cultural definition, and this is what I want you to see, is this. It's the secularized belief that what they would describe as traditional masculinity, which really is what we see described, how they describe traditional masculinity is very similar to what we see as creational masculinity, how God designed men to be and to live and to function in the world. What our culture tells us is that belief that traditional masculinity is inherently flawed and defective. In other words, being a man is not a good thing. Why? It's a bad thing. Why? Because masculine men are made with a masculine energy. That masculine energy in and of itself is what? Is flawed, it's dangerous, it's destructive. For example, Dr. Michael Carson, not a believer. I think he's a psychologist. He taught at a major university. He's also a lawyer. A couple years ago in Psychology Today, he wrote The Myth of Toxic Masculinity. And he wrote this: currently in psychology, it seems to be culturally allowed and even expected to hate men. And therefore, if you hate men, you blame all ills perpetuated by men on masculinity. In other words, all the problems in society are men's fault, and what makes men bad? Well, the one thing they all have in common is what? Their masculinity. And to attribute then the capacity to perpetuate similar ills to all men. In other words, it's not just some men who have created problems that are toxic, but if they create these problems because their masculinity is toxic, and all men have masculinity, then what? All men are toxic. Why? Because masculinity is inherently bad. The message here, masculinity itself is toxic and bad for the world. That's the opposite message of what God says. Masculinity is what? Good for what? The world. And the reason our world is in the state it is because it's lacking what? It's lacking men who are living out their design. I saw this cartoon. You should apologize for toxic masculinity, the woman says. The man says, I'm non-binary today. The woman says, oh, sorry. The man says, no worries. What's the message? Message is this. Because masculinity is bad, men must be ashamed of their masculinity. I will just be non-binary. That way I can get around it. I mentioned this several months ago in the 2018 APA guidelines, American Psychological Association guidelines for men and boys. This is the where the American Psychological Association gives a guideline that they give out to all their counselors. Here's how you work with men and boys in your practice. And what they say in it is traditional masculinity, as we would, similar to what the Bible would describe, is psychologically harmful, causing boys damage that echoes both inwardly and outwardly. That's what our American Psychological Association believes, and they're telling all the counselors and therapists who are part of that. And so as you bring your son, as you go into a counselor that buys into the American Psychological Association beliefs, guess what they're going to be thinking about you when they look at you or look at your son? There's something bad about you. And what it is, it's your identity. It's who you are as a man. And somehow we got to get rid of it. But what they do is they typically try to turn jerks, if I put it like this, generalized, turn jerks into wimps. Because a wimp is what? He's non-toxic. But according to our definition, what? They're both toxic. Why? Because they fail to bless and they fail to give life. And that's what men were made to do. Note, while our culture is saying masculinity is itself inherently toxic, what I am saying is masculinity itself is inherently good. Why? Because when God made the world, he looked at everything, he made it, and then after each day he said what? It is good, it is good. And the last day he makes man, and he looks at it, everything, and he said, man and woman, and he looks at them and he says what? This is very good. God designed masculinity to reflect himself. That's why it's good. It's a reflection of God. Masculinity brings blessing, not harm, to the world when it is reflected faithfully as God created it to be reflected. Masculinity only turns toxic when men violate their design. Does that make sense? Let me give you an illustration. This is good masculinity. What is this a picture of? Anybody recognize that? Niagara Falls. This is bad, toxic masculinity. Disregard the arrow and the red circle there. This is a tsunami. Okay, what's the difference between good masculinity and bad masculinity? Yeah. Good masculinity is power and movement being directed forward in a life-giving way. What's directing the power and the movement? The banks, right? And because it's being directed in a way, if you know anything about what goes on there in that area, they have all kinds of hydropower. They create power that is life-giving and blesses, right? What's toxic masculinity? It's power and movement being driven about in life-diminishing ways. It's just going all over. There's no direction. It's not brought in and given a sense of forward movement. It's just going everywhere. Pardon me? Yes. This represents design, and this is a violation of design. That's the difference between good masculinity and toxic masculinity. For example, a man can use his power and strength to harm others as a predator, or what? To shield others as a protector, right? Same power. One does what? Harms, one blesses. He can use his aggression and force to take hostages as a terrorist, or to rescue hostages as a hero. It's the same aggression and force that accomplishes both. One harms, the other blesses. He can use his drive and achievement, commitment to achieving things, to control others as an oppressor, or to bless others as a provider. Same power and movement. He can use women and sex to selfishly take and use as a rapist, or to lovingly give and receive as a husband. In other words, what I want you to see is this. Our masculinity is inherently good. It's nothing to be ashamed of. It's something to be proud of. Why? Because it reflects and images the God who made you. And he is not someone to be ashamed of. But it will quickly become toxic, destructive, harmful, bad, the moment we forget the God whose life-giving power our masculinity is designed to reflect. Now, to see how this happens, we are going to examine the 4 downward steps into submasculine manhood. And what were they? Self-doubt, self-trust, idolatrous vows or idolatrous commitments, and bad movement. And again, what we're going to see is these are the building blocks of toxic masculinity. And the big idea that we're going to come away with today is this. Men who live sub-masculine lives will always manifest toxic masculinity, whether it's as a jerk or whether it's as a wimp. And we will see this right after the break. Prior to the break, as we're seated, what are you taking away so far? What are you hearing me say? Men are bad. Men are bad? Well, you've been someplace else. You haven't been listening to us here. What are you hearing me say? Or what is God saying to you through what we've been talking about? This is true? It rings true.
Failing on every category.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. Our world basically says that toxic masculinity are jerks, and the solution to toxic masculinity is to become a wimp. But what we're saying is, no, this is toxic, harmful, destructive, sinful, and so is this. So while our world recognizes something is wrong with masculinity, its solution isn't to go back to the original design. The solution is to do what? Emasculate it, destroy it altogether. So what we're saying is that the solution to toxic masculinity, be it wimp or jerk, is what? God's design. So prior to the break then, to understand how masculinity becomes toxic, we said we're going to examine these 4 downward steps into submasculine manhood. And they are self-doubt, self-trust, or idolatrous commitments, and bad movement. And these are the building blocks, these 4 steps are the building blocks of toxic masculinity. And the big idea we're going to see today is men who live submasculine lives will manifest toxic masculinity, be it a jerk or a wimp. So let's look at these. Steps 1 and 2, we've already talked about them. Step 1 was self-doubt, which was, remember, the legacy of Adam. And step 2 was self-trust, which was what? The way of Cain. And the question is this: what happens to a man when he goes down these 2 steps? Step 1, we're infected with step 1. We're already there. But we can choose or not choose to go down step 2, but typically we all do. We all do, the way of Cain. What happens when we go down these first 2 steps? That's the question. Answer: what happens is we put ourselves in a very uncomfortable place. A very uncomfortable place. Oh, dude, I'm not. Sorry. There, can you hear me better now? Now? Can you hear me? Okay. Is that working now? Yes. Okay. We put ourselves in a bad place. What is that bad place? Well, watch with me here. First step, there we go. First step, self-doubt. Do I have what it takes as a man? The legacy of Adam. When you add that to the second step, self-trust, I will make life work on my own, or the way of Cain. What do those 2 things produce, you think, in a man that's very uncomfortable? It produces what we're going to call an internal bind, a psychological bind. You put yourself between a rock and a hard place. What's the bind that we find ourselves in when we go down self-doubt and self-trust? Here's what it is. What I doubt is also what I trust. What I doubt is also what I trust. You see the bind you put yourself in? Those are 2 opposite things, aren't they? I doubt me, I trust me. What do you think that creates inside a man? Internal discomfort, anxiety, confusion, indecisiveness, restlessness, anger and shame. I should know what to do. Guilt. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance. It's believing 2 opposite things at the same time. When we take the first step, we're born into the first step, but when we go the way of Cain, the second step, we place ourselves in this bind that causes us to be internally very uncomfortable. We just know something isn't right, but we can't put our finger on it. In other words, when the legacy of Adam, the inborn masculine fear of being exposed as weak and inadequate, unites in a man's heart and unites in our hearts with the way of Cain, which is what? The commitment to trust our own way, wisdom, and resources to protect ourselves instead of trusting God, Genesis 4. What that does, it triggers in our souls a terrifying question. And again, what's the question? Do I have what it takes to be the man I'm required to be in this world? And that produces in a man's mind an uncomfortable internal bind. I am not adequate to make it in this world as a man, but I still will trust myself to make it anyway. Guys, we're really foolish and stubborn, aren't we? Now here's my question. What do men naturally do with this uncomfortable bind? Oh, we do something. We seek relief. Answer, the third step. We seek relief from the bind by making 3 idolatrous commitments. What are they? I must figure out what to do. I can only trust myself, but I can't trust myself, so I got to work hard and figure out what to do. Second, I must protect that part of me that feels afraid and vulnerable, because if I don't, nobody else will. And I don't want to be exposed. And thirdly, I must find a place that will give me rest, because I tell you what, trying to figure out a place to where I can make life work and protecting that part of me, that leaves you what? Exhausted. So I got to find a place to rest. Now let's look at these 3 commitments. Commitment number 1, I must figure out what to do. This idolatrous commitment, if we're playing it in our mind, sounds something like this. This is a story we tell ourselves. I must find a rule, a formula, or principle that will always make my world manageable and my life predictable. I must find a rule, formula, or principle about marriage so that my marriage will always be manageable and that nothing unpredictable will ever happen to me in my marriage. I'm never going to be caught by surprise by my wife. Or I need to find a principle for raising my kids and building my family. Why? So that my life and my family can be manageable and everything will always go as planned. When you commit yourself to that, then you commit yourself to the second part. I will justify any kind of masculine movement that brings manageability to my world and predictability to my life. Hey, if I'm nice and it works, great. If I'm nice and it doesn't work and I get loud and big, great. If my kids don't do what I tell them to do and I give them candy and bribe them, great. Anything to do what? Manage my world and make my life predictable. Because I'm in this bind. I doubt myself, but I can only trust myself. And what that looks like in our relationship with God, it looks something like this. I will seek after God as long as He is useful in helping me figure out how to manage my world and bring predictability to my life. God then becomes my butler. God becomes my genie. God becomes the vending machine of my life. I put in the correct change, figure out what the correct change is, put it in, pull a lever, and I should get what I want. What do I want? I want manageability and predictability so that I can have relief. Commitment number 2, I must protect that part of me that feels afraid and vulnerable. This kind of sounds like this. This is the story we tell ourselves in our head. I will avoid those risky places where I could be exposed as weak and inadequate. Those difficult conversations with my wife. Dealing with my kids' anger and rebellion. Talking to my boss who seems like he has treated me unjustly. I'm going to avoid those places. But I will move only in safe places where I feel competent, capable, and strong. I want to feel strong, so I'm going to go to those places where I always know what to do. I always feel strong. I always feel competent. I know how to play baseball, so I'll go play baseball 5 nights a week. I know how to work really well. I'll go do that. I will find a place, a hobby, something to do, and I will only move in safe places. I will avoid risky places. And I will use my power when I need to intimidate those who threaten to expose me by demanding too much of me. I've had a lot going on at work today. A lot was demanded of me. And I come home and the first thing I see is my kids come running to the door, glad I'm home, and they grab you around the ankles. And what do? I get angry and big and scream and yell. Why? Because I've had so much required of me. All I want is relief. And now more is being required of me. Don't you dare require more of me. And that then brings us to commitment 3. I got to find a place that'll give me rest. A place where I can escape the sweat and toil of an adversarial world, Genesis 3. A place without the demands and conflict of relationships, Genesis 3. A place where I am never required to do what? Act like a man. I need that place. Now here's the note, guys. While rest is indeed a legitimate need that God has built into creation itself, why do you think there's a Sabbath? everything comes to a rest, including human beings. God made us to legitimately need rest. And he also promises us what? Rest. Jesus, Matthew 11, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, what? I'll give you rest. God made us to have rest. It's a legitimate need, and God promises to give rest. But this idolatrous commitment seeks to satisfy the need for rest apart from God and always in illegitimate places. Jeremiah 2:13. Pleasure places. Places like fantasy and food. Or numbing places. Places like alcohol or drugs or technology. You just kind of numb out, zone out, you know? Scrolling. You were looking kind of confused. That's my scrolling. Mastery places. Work or hobbies. Yeah.
Back a little further when you said something about, I forgot what you did. Okay, you do, before you do step 1 and step 2, and then you said, I'm only going to want God in a certain manner later on.
Yeah,
okay?
yeah.
So you're seeking him there, okay? Well, before step 1 and step 2, I think some of us ask for God up here, and if we don't get an answer, then we start down the 4 steps.
Yeah.
That's what I feel like.
Yeah.
Okay? If I don't get an answer, then I feel like I don't know what to do, so I start down those 4 steps.
Yeah. Yeah. That's where we're using God. That's
okay.
the same thing.
Yeah, we're using him down here. I forget where you
I'm not
had it on
seeking
there.
you to know you. I'm seeking you to get an answer to what to do here. Make my life work.
At that point, what I'm saying
Yeah.
is before you got to that, you did ask further up the ladder. At least I think
Yeah.
I did.
Okay, maybe you did, maybe others don't.
Right, what
We're
I'm
all
saying
gonna
is,
be different. Yeah.
I'm thinking, I asked up here before I didn't know what to do, and then I took these 2 steps, and now I'm asking down here when it's too late. I'm like, if you'd asked me up here, I wouldn't be down here.
Yeah.
I'm stuck.
Yeah. We're all going to be different in how this applies, but I think there are general themes here that we can learn from and see ourselves in. Let me add this also, note for us as Christian men. We often seek relief through the same idolatrous commitments that we have Christianized. For example, I must figure out what to do turns into, I must find a biblical principle to tell me how to live. The second, I must protect that part of me that feels afraid and vulnerable, turns into living by biblical principles will protect me from my fears and vulnerabilities. The third, I must find a place that gives me the rest I desire or I need, turns into living by biblical principles will give me a predictable life that lets me rest. You see examples of these. All you got to do is go on Amazon or go into a Christian bookstore. Biblical principles for mastering Christian finance. First of all, what's Christian finance as opposed to finance?
Tithing.
And how do you master something that's all over the board? Well, find biblical principles, and you'll never have to worry again. Then there are the 5 biblical principles to help you feel your best, taking steps to a better you, a healthier you. Then there are the biblical principles for achieving personal success, your best life now. Then there are 8 biblical goal-setting principles to keep you focused on God. Then there are 7 biblical principles on parenting. And then there are biblical principles of leadership. And then there are biblical principles for Christian marriage. If you just follow those, you'll have everything right. Everything will go right for you. And you don't know how many times I've talked with guys. They said, I did all the right things. I followed all the biblical principles, and my marriage turned into this. I must not have followed the right principles, or God didn't come through as he was supposed to. You see, principles, you make a deal with God. I'll do the principle, you fulfill the principle. Then there are the biblical principles for giving and living. And then there's the essential principles for a godly life. And then there are the biblical principles for business. And then finally and lastly, my favorite, 52 biblical principles You take one every day like a vitamin, and you live a healthy. And the message of all of these books is this: you can master your world and get the rest you desire by following certain biblical principles. Now, what's wrong with this principled approach to Christianity? What's wrong with it? 6 things. It prevents me as a man from having to struggle with and trust a God I can neither see nor control. You know, Hebrews says that what pleases God is faith. And when you look at how Hebrews describes faith, it's faith in an invisible God who is moving in invisible ways, who will do things in ways that become visible. But when I use principles, I don't have to trust in that kind of God. I don't have to struggle with that kind of faith. It deceives me into believing that I can escape the toil and sweat of a broken adversarial world. Just do all the right things and you can have the best life now. It discourages me from honestly facing the confusion, fears, and hurts going on inside of me. I don't have to deal with these things. Why? Because I'm doing all the principles. It creates in my heart a false sense of hope and security if I find the right principles. And I'm doing the principles, like I said, but it doesn't turn out I must have doing the wrong principles, or I can't trust you, God. It negates my need to live with the courage and imagination of a warrior poet. And it views God as useful for obtaining a comfortable life in a well-managed world. In other words, principled Christianity encourages idolatrous commitments. So then, what have we seen? In step 3, a man seeks relief from his uncomfortable bind, the result of steps 1 and 2, by making these 3 idolatrous commitments. I must figure out what to do, I must protect something vulnerable in me, and I must find a place that gives me rest. That brings us to the final step, step 4, bad movement. Steps 1, 2, and 3 bring me to bad movement. Because of their idolatrous nature, the 3 commitments will stop all good masculine movement of a warrior poet, and it will set into motion bad movement of what we're going to call a dreamer destroyer. Okay? It perverts the warrior poet movement and it turns it into the movement, bad movement of a dreamer destroyer. Now, what is a dreamer destroyer? It's a term that we're going to use to describe the toxic perversion, notice it's a perversion, and it's harmful, of the warrior poet that manifests itself through 2 kinds of bad masculine movement. The dreamer is movement without courage to risk. And then there's the destroyer, which is movement without imagination to see beyond. The dreamer, he moves, but he has no courage to risk anything. The destroyer, he moves, but he doesn't see beyond anything right there that might be threatening him. The dreamer has no warrior spirit and perverts his poetic imagination. Put another way, he uses imagination to retreat into what is not to see what could be. Whereas the destroyer has no poetic spirit, and he perverts his warrior strength, meaning he uses his power to control what is, not to create something new. Let's look at these profiles. The profile of a dreamer. Movement without courage, imagination without risk. Every one of these statements will describe a man who is moving without courage and using imagination without risk. First, he's a passive avoider who escapes chaos by disappearing into his head. He's just not there. He's not present. He presents himself as a visionary. Man, I got all these dreams, all these ideas, but he always lacks the courage to to act or risk. Movement without courage, imagination without risk. He's a nice guy who never makes waves so as not to create conflict. Why? Movement without courage, imagination without risk. When overwhelmed, he will retreat into depression as a safe house. He just goes there. Why? Movement without courage, imagination without risk. He often himself as confused to escape being exposed as inadequate. When I'm confused, I don't have to have courage or I don't have to risk. Why? I'm confused. I don't know what to do. He uses TV, movies, gaming, sexual fantasy to turn inward away from life. He has transcendent ideas, but they're not out what could be. They're here inside his own private world. He uses sex and romance to access feelings of transcendence. See, imagination produces a feeling of transcendence. But he doesn't experience transcendence as a man moving in the world. The only place he experiences it by turning inward and using sex and the pleasure of sex and romance. There's a sense of transcendence he experiences in that. Something bigger is going on. He will not engage a cause that will stretch him, challenge him, or cost him. Why? Movement without courage, imagination without risk. He lives and acts out of fear, not strength. A classic codependent guy. That's the profile of a dreamer. What about a destroyer profile? Well, this is movement without imagination, power without blessing. Okay? Every one of these statements are going to describe a man who moves without imagination, seeing beyond what could be, and power without blessing. He uses power, but not to bless others, so that people can thrive and relationships can flourish. He is an aggressive avoider who escapes chaos by attacking it or overpowering it. He doesn't engage it to tame it and subdue it and to shape it and form it. He just destroys it altogether. He presents himself as a mover and shaker, but lacks ability to see beyond himself. He doesn't see how his power can bless. He sees how his power, his movement, and all that he does can build his own little world to protect himself, how he can build his own city. He's a classic type A who views relationships as a means to his chosen end. Again, movement without imagination, power without blessing. He competes for power, shows little kindness or mercy to others. He's committed to a cause above people. He sees people as expendable. They're useful for his cause. And what's his cause about? It's about him, expanding his power. He is a bully who gets his way by using power to intimidate, shame, and control. He's a cynic who kills the hope of others to protect his own status and agenda. When people have hopes, when they begin to develop hope, oh, I like this, maybe this, he's got to kill that, because when a person has hope, guess where they're going? They might be going in a different direction, and that threatens him, and he's got to destroy that. So the way to destroy it is by being a cynic. Oh, that won't work. I've tried that, nothing there. Guys, how many times do we do that with our wives and our kids? That's a destroyer. The destroyer presents himself, presents as an impatient, angry, critical guy, a short fuse with an explosive temper. You don't want to get in this guy's way. You want to make him mad. Everybody tiptoes around him. And he turns to anger and violence to destroy whatever exposes his vulnerability. That's how he keeps that part of him that feels vulnerable safe, by anger. And so, step 4 opens us as men to two kinds of bad movement that are toxic perversions of the warrior poet. The dreamer, movement without the courage to risk, has no warrior spirit and perverts his poetic imagination, and he uses imagination to retreat into what is not instead of seeing beyond to what could be. The destroyer is movement without imagination to see beyond. He has no poetic spirit and perverts his warrior strength. How? By using power to control what is instead of creating new places to bless others. Two bad kinds of movement, the dreamer or the destroyer. Or we could say the jerk or the wimp. So, bringing this all to an end, what did we do today? What did we say today? Well, in a nutshell, basically our purpose today was to examine the topic of toxic masculinity. And our strategy was to ask two basic questions. Here's how we dealt with this. First question was this: what in the world is toxic masculinity? We hear about it, we read about it, we talk about it. What is it? What we said is toxic masculinity is the perversion of God's design of our masculinity that harms rather than blesses, is life-diminishing rather than life-giving. And that could be the jerk or the destroyer on the one side, or it could equally be the wimp or the dreamer on the other. What is toxic masculinity? It's all masculinity lived apart from God's design. What is masculinity? Toxic masculinity? It is the sinful product of sub-masculine living. It's not just toxic, guys. It's sinful. Why? Because God designed the world to work in a certain way. Everything is to play its part. And when everything plays its part, then the world works as it should. Shalom. What sin is sin moves out of the order. Something is moved out of the order that God placed the world to work in. When it goes out of order, what happens to God's creation? It's disordered. The Bible says sin is lawlessness. You know what? Another way to translate that, understand that? Sin is the disregard of God's design. And so toxic masculinity is not just toxic because it's harmful and it's life-diminishing. It's sinful. It's always the product of sub-masculine living. The refusal to obey the command, act like men. And this understanding of toxic masculinity we saw today differs from the cultural definition, which believes that masculinity, that which reflects God, is itself bad. And it's not. Masculinity is good, it reflects God, and God made our world to need it so that it would function as He designed it. It becomes bad, it turns bad when we fail to live out our design. The second question, how does masculinity become toxic? The 4 steps downward, the building blocks: self-doubt, the inborn shame and fear of being exposed as weak and inadequate that we all face, and that we're infected with, the legacy of Adam. Step 2, self-trust, the decision to trust our own resources instead of risk trusting God, Genesis 4, which is the way of Cain. Self-doubt and self-trust combine together to produce an uncomfortable bind. It puts us between a rock and a hard place. What I doubt is also what I trust. Creates anxiety, restlessness, confusion. Then to escape that bind and find the rest that we long for. Step 3, we make 3 idolatrous commitments. I must figure out what to do. I must protect that part of me that feels vulnerable, and I must find a place that will give me rest. And that brings us to step 4. It produces 2 kinds of bad masculine movement perversions that are perversions of a warrior poet. The first, a dreamer, a man with no warrior spirit who perverts his poetic imagination by looking inward to escape chaos. And the destroyer, a man who has no poetic spirit, who perverts his warrior strength by looking outward to destroy the chaos. And where do these 4 steps lead, guys? Where do they lead? They lead to a world populated by sub-masculine men who lack moral character, moral clarity, moral courage, and moral conviction. And when our world lacks men with character, clarity, courage, and conviction, what happens to the world? Well, we have a world where men are not acting as they're created to be, and the world is falling apart. You see how that works? Our world is telling us that the world doesn't need men, that men are the problem. And it seeks to emasculate men, to tell them that power that reflects God and is to bless and is to give life is the problem with the world. And it's not. The problem with the world is that men don't believe God, and we live out our masculine design in submasculine ways. What's my point? Our world desperately needs fully masculine men. Men who will be manly. Men who will act like men. And this is our challenge. What I want to challenge all of us, including myself, with. Will we become those men? Will you become that man in your marriage, in your family, in your community, in your church, on your job, in this world? It's scary. But the world needs men. You say, but I want to, but I don't know how. That's a problem for most of us, isn't it? We're never taught how. Our dads were never taught how. Our pastors, I got some biblical principles on how to be a man.
You got a book on that?
But don't read it.
Don't read it.
Our church is pastored by men who've never been taught. How do we become men? Well, come back next time as we continue in our series, Restored Masculinity, moving toward the hope of living out God's good design. Guys, we will never fully be restored this side of our resurrection. But we can begin to experience more and more and more of it. Why? Because Jesus not only died, but he rose again to make us new. And the newness began when the day we were born again. It will continue through this life, through the power of the Spirit and our learning to participate with what he's doing, but we will not be fully restored as men until we are given the new body in the new creation. But until then, it can be a good life being a man. We can bless, and we can make a difference, and we can bring life to this world. We're going to talk about that next time. See you then.